Innsmouth, stranger.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest of honor, Mr. Ramsey Campbell.
Hey.
I am but an electronic simulation.
So perhaps we could start by talking about actually what you're doing at the moment. Because did I see the other day on your Facebook page you were starting a new book, or you were starting a new story?
Always, always, it never ends, believe you me. A novel called An Echo of Children. I'm just about somewhere in the middle of chapter 5, I think, and it's a supernatural tale. More than this, I cannot say. My lips are sealed, but basically because I loathe talking about stuff in progress, basically. I'll tell you about everything else, by all means. Now, this is the Three Stooges convention, isn't it?
It looks like it, doesn't it?
It's starting to feel that way, yeah. Because you're a big Three Stooges fan, right? I think.
I've written a book about them just out now. Yes. Six Stooges and counting.
Yeah.
My personal journey through the oeuvre of the Three Stooges. The trouble is, it never ends, because every time I think I've finished the wretched book, I discover there's yet another film I've not seen, which has been thought to be lost for most of a century, and all of a sudden somebody discovered it and put it up online. So I've got to revise. So wait for the second printing. Well, they'll buy the first printing. What am I doing? I'm ruining my own career as I speak.
Do you see any connection between weird fiction and slapstick? We often say that Lovecraft had more of a sense of humour than perhaps he's credited for.
Well, I mean, he is the man who wrote in the Colour Out of Space, the Dutchman's breeches have become a thing of sinister menace, which certainly actually, if you're in Amsterdam and have done some cake, you'll find that becomes very true. Sorry, I didn't ask you a question, did I? Or did I?
Yeah, because we've often talked when we're covering like the letters between, specifically the ones between Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith. They seem to be having tremendous fun.
Oh gosh, I think so. Yes.
With the return addresses, I mean, some of those were absolutely tremendous.
Yes.
It's like you had quite a correspondence with August Derleth.
I did.
How was that? What was the sort of correspondence like between the two of you?
Well, the weird thing is, it only became apparent to me much later on that my correspondence with August was very much like his correspondence with Lovecraft. It was the same sort of fundamental relationship. The older guy was the literary mentor, and gradually you get the impression of the younger chap, gaining confidence and arguing and saying, well, I don't think you're right about this particular editing notion. We had a great time. We had a great correspondence. In many ways, August was, the father I never had, because the father I did have was this invisible figure who lived in the same house with me and my mother, but, was on the other side of the door. It was the monster in the night, the footsteps and the stairs, because they'd become estranged when I was very young indeed. And so Derleth really became, in many ways, my advisor, not just about writing, although certainly that to begin with, but, living as well. So, yes, it was a great relationship. And in fact, you may have seen that we ultimately did publish a book by S.T. Joshi, edited a collection of all the letters that we could find. And it's, I think, now out of print. So it's about time. Well, I'll have a word with the guys at PS. If anybody's interested, give them a shout and we'll try and do a second edition.
And how did you first get in touch with August? I mean, was it a case of you read some Lovecraft, or you read some Arkham House and you just wrote to him? How did that relationship begin?
There's quite a story on that. I mean, I think probably I better go back even a little further, if you don't mind. To not my first encounter with Lovecraft, which was when I was 8, and I read The Colour Out of Space and was appalled and amazed, and basically I'd never read anything quite like it, even though I'd read, some Poe, some M.R. James and so forth. This seemed to me to be on a different level, and to be, digging much deeper and darker, basically, than anything I'd ever read previously. But however, and I know you guys will find this difficult to believe if you don't know the history of it, but in 1960, by 1960, there had never been a single British paperback collection of Lovecraft stories published. And so when I happened upon one, which was the first one, Cry Horror, which in fact had been edited by Don Walheim way back in the 40s as The Lurking Fear. This was a reprint. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to buy it because I didn't have enough money on me, but thank God I managed to scrape up £0.50 in farthings or whatever it was and buy the thing. And went home and I've got to say, skived off school the next day. I just read the book from cover to cover, and I became imbued with Lovecraft. And I knew, I've been trying out different things previously. I mean, none of which were very good. But now I knew I wanted to write like this. This is what I wanted to do. And I started imitating not so very much longer after that than that. The same year, 1960, I was already doing the first stories that ultimately would become my first book, heavily rewritten, mind you. But at this point, I was, various of us were correspondents, fan correspondents, and one guy, Pat Kearney, who later became a historian of erotica and of the Olympia Press and places like that. He was always, like me, always very anti-censorship. Pat was a fanzine editor, and we were put in touch through the British Science Fiction Postal Library by Peter Maybe, who was then the librarian, because we both borrowed issues of Weird Tales magazine. Pat and I got into correspondence. I happened to mention to him that I'd done these Lovecraftian stories. He asked, could he read them? And I sent off the only copy, actually, this handwritten first draft. So, if that had got lost in the Royal Mail, we wouldn't be talking here now, because I'd be sitting in a corner sobbing right now, I should think. But no, it didn't get lost. Pat read him, asked if he could publish one of them in his fanzine, and duly did. Meanwhile, though, he and one of his readers, Betty Kujawa from Indiana, an American fan, said, "Well, why not show these to August Derleth, who, his Lovecraft, publisher, and just to see, what did he think?" So I duly wrote August a letter saying, "I've written these stories, and you are clearly the world's authority on Lovecraft, which, in many ways he was. Would you like to see them and give me your view?" Which is, a naive 14-year-old's kind of a thing to do. And he wrote back, obviously this is controversial, but he wrote back saying, "Well, listen, we own the copyright on the Lovecraft mythos, and we need to approve these stories before you can publish them," which was not what I'd asked him at all. But nevertheless, obviously, he wanted to see them, asked me to type them up. I typed them up, and he spent a couple of months before he replied about them. By this time, we were already in a sort of correspondence. And he wrote back this long letter saying, basically, these stories did a lot of work, which by gum they certainly did, for all sorts of reasons. But if you're prepared to do the editorial work on them, and if you have more ideas to develop into stories of a similar kind, then we might be able to do a book of them at Arkham House. Which, when you're 14 is pretty damn fighting talk, So, one, I'd recovered from that, and two, recovered from saying all these editorial suggestions are nonsense, which I turned that round about half an hour later, and I did the work. Not least the thing that I had actually set them all in Lovecraft country, in Massachusetts, Arkham and the like. Yeah. And Derleth quite rightly said, no, you need to create your own settings, and British settings, which is going to make them, give them that much more individuality. So I duly invented Winchester and the rest of these places down the Severn Valley way, and did the rewrites, and ultimately Derleth, felt that not much extra editing was needed, and my first book came out when I was 18, and I've not really looked back since.
It's a great thing. It's really interesting because when I started, I did exactly the same thing. I set everything in Arkham and Innsmouth until I read the drugstore Indian reprint of Inhabitant of the Lake.
Right.
And it had you mentioned the letters with August Derleth, and I went,
yes,
what is right? I haven't got a clue what I'm writing about here. So I'm going to write about somewhere I know.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So it's tremendous advice that I think I'm not alone in that it's that August Derleth's advice is helping authors to this day in that respect.
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'm always struck by with your writing, especially I've just finished reading Fellstones quite recently, is how much detail you had in that, like with the music and all the rest of it. So how much research goes into something like Fellstones?
Well, on the music, absolutely none, because when I was actually, I finally had an opportunity to draw upon, my love of music, and all those observations and things were just things I'd collected over the decades, thoughts I'd had, little kind of insights, I hope that, might have been useful. But also, obviously, they had to have something to do with the overall narrative. I couldn't just shove them in and hope that they stuck. I wanted them to have some reason to be there. But no, that's like my sort of music book, if you like. Just as say, I don't know, Ancient Images and The Grin of the Dark. Those are my movie novels. Where I've always loved the cinema. Well, pretty well from when I can remember, and certainly from when I was 14, I really started going in a serious way. Not least because back then, you had to pass for 16 to get into the X films in Britain. I mean, which meant nearly every horror film ever made. So even something like Plan 9 from Outer Space had an X. Believe it or not. And by gum, did I ever like that one? One of my favourite films. I heard nothing said against Edward, I'll tell you that. But let me see. The other thing I was going to say about Fellstones is really, if you want, I think I acknowledge this in subtle ways. It's really sort of my Colour Out of Space in a way. I mean, it's a sort of variation on it, but I think you can see, that's sort of looming in the background in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the thing is, we can think of Lovecraft and the mythos as being quite specific to Arkham and Innsmouth and that sort of area. But then when we look at the themes or the Lovecraftian themes and the wider picture, they're universal, right? That can be any time, any place, any setting. So that allows an author or game designer or whatever pretty much free reign, I guess.
Yes,
and do you think maybe that's a reason for the continued popularity, well, the increasing popularity of Lovecraft?
Well, I would have thought so, yeah. But I mean, obviously he has been discovered to some extent by, a much larger audience, an audience outside, if you like, even the horror aficionados. I mean, I was amazed. Coming back to music, funnily enough. Earlier this year, in one of the Proms broadcasts, the actual Promenade concerts on Radio 3, and in the interval there was let me see, there was a new work which is basically about the solar system. I think I can't tell you exactly now, but it was or a sort of celestial work of classical music. And the commentator said, well, you could have, if you're going to do this sort of music, you could either do the kind of mystical host kind of planets approach, or the Lovecraftian cosmic approach. So he's now passed so much into the mainstream, into the common consciousness. You could even throw in a reference to him in a classical music concert. So he's there, he's arrived, guys. We've arrived at last.
And isn't that a thing? Doesn't that show up that sort of division, if you like, between, on the one hand, going into space can be a spiritual experience, and I guess hopefully over the next 50, 100, 200 years, that's where we're going, sort of thing.
Sure.
On the other hand, are we leaving our little island and heading off into the darkness? Yeah.
Well, yes, perhaps. Yes. Who knows what awaits us? That's the thing. Yeah, absolutely.
And I had a question. I'm just on the last book of the Dayloth trilogy, which I'm really enjoying.
Oh, thank you.
And one thing that struck me about that was that on the one hand, it's a tale of everyday life. We follow these characters through these different stages in their life and what they're doing. They're at school and everything else, which was all really brilliantly observed, I thought. And on the other hand, there's this growing sense of unease and things aren't quite right. And I'm quite in awe of how you balance that across 3 books. So how do you, what's your sort of meter? What's your sort of setting for thinking, no, it's too much mundanity, but at the same time, you don't want to, if Nyarlathotep turns up on page 3, I always think that's a bit sort of, how do you make
you don't want to be too premature, that's absolutely right. But, isn't this the Lovecraftian approach, a very gradual accumulation of detail? and hints and suggestions, and they gradually build into I mean, to my mind, actually, I think that one of the things you have to get right. We have to get everything right if you can, but one of the things that's most crucial to get right is that shift from the the inexplicit and suggestive to the final revelation. Or actually, I mean, in the trilogy there are, I suppose, a few revelations. Given that there are 3 volumes, and I felt, I mean, this was the thing. But my old friend Pete Crowther at PS Publishing, you can blame him for the whole thing, because it was he who said to me basically, we should have a supernatural horror trilogy, maybe a cosmic horror trilogy. And he basically kept saying, we meet well, at the very least we meet at conventions, but often go and visit one of the my family, Jenny and me and Nikki and Pete. And he would remind me every so often. My thing with this, you see, is the only reason to write a trilogy is if there is a reason, an actual reason why it must be a trilogy. It can't just, for me, can't just be a big long novel chopped into 3 bits, 3 volumes. And eventually, this whole idea occurred to me. Well, what's supposing that there are several decades between each pair of volumes, and it follows the characters pretty well through their entire lives. But at the same time, the supernatural element is itself developing. And so, from a very clandestine cult in the first volume, it moves into something more apparently innocuous and official in the second volume, and in the third, it's out there in open sight. It's got a skyscraper on the waterfront in Liverpool, but at the same time, obviously, there are things underlying it. There are hidden elements that we only gradually learn. I think that was part of the task for me with this book was to make it more and more visible, and yet preserve the sense of enigma, the sense of something larger than it shows. And well, to be honest, I mean, to answer your question that you asked in the first place, I've got no answer. It's instinctive. I mean, I can I can only do it and feel that until it feels right. I mean, obviously, rewriting has a lot to do with it. It may not be right in the first draft. In fact, it very seldom is. And I try and get it, refine it, particularly in the rewrite. And I'm more and more ruthless in doing that. So with luck, we succeeded. I should incidentally say, of course, that Jeff Vandermeer picked me up the post, because he did the Southern Reach trilogy while I was still struggling with probably the first volume. But well, what the hell? There's room for 2 good ones, I think.
Absolutely, that was a really good trilogy as well, actually. Yeah,
for sure,
absolutely splendid. Yeah, and something I've always admired about your work is the fact that it's in the modern era that there is a tendency, like Rob said, to pardon the expression, sort of blow your wad too quickly.
Yes, yeah.
Things go at 100 miles an hour. It's almost like the sort of jump cut MTV kind of thing, but in a literary form. Whereas I've always found you tend to go for that sort of quiet build, which, when done right, is tremendously creepy. It's but how hard do you find it to sort of maintain that tension? I mean, an example for me would be Midnight Sun. It's just that uncanny sort of thing running through it. How hard do you find it to keep that tension sort of wound up?
Well, I think that again comes back right down to the rewrite, because in fact, I have a tendency in the first draft to do exactly what you've just said. In fact, to go at it too fast, too soon, and pile too much stuff into the early chapters, particularly of a novel, not so much a short story, maybe. And I then, well, I mean, I'm aware of having done this right now in this novel in progress. Actually, I can see what I've done in the first chapter. There's too much, too much too early. But okay, that's what rewriting is for. So I think the answer to your question is again precisely, it's the rewrite that gets the form right. If you've got it wrong in the first place. But to some extent, the first draft is a matter of setting out your material to see what you have to work with, and then you get around to reshaping it later on. And I think it's extremely important, as you say, to get the gradual build up right, and not to, basically not to show too much too early. But I think, you know, it's also the sort of fiction that I love. So, you know, Lovecraft being a classic instance, M.R. James being
Yeah.
another.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, so it's the kind of thing I grew up with, and it's, you know, really the kind of thing I'm trying to do myself as well.
We've seen a lot of Lovecraftian adaptations over the years. I'm thinking like TV and film, some more successful than others.
Sure.
And we've had things like the Cabinet of Curiosities just recently, which again, Netflix, so like a mainstream,
Yes.
thing. Which of your stories do you think would make a good film or TV show? And is there any prospect of that happening, do you think, in the future?
Well, I mean, you know, there are, you know, there are always feelers out, you know, options and stuff. But I'd rather not talk about those because it might magic them away. I can tell you, however, that, you know, Guillermo del Toro is a fan, and he brought the story called Down There to be done as an episode of his series. So with luck, we may be seeing that pretty soon. In terms of what hasn't been, well, I actually do think the trilogy could do pretty well, you know, but I think it would have to be a series, either that or, well, good lord, a trilogy of films. I don't know whether that would work. More probably, you know, a Netflix series or a series on Shudder, maybe. I don't know. A channel, incidentally, which, you know, has impressed me quite a lot, Shudder. I think, you know, they are genuinely trying to do something, you know, other than the sort of standard horror movie that we're seeing at the moment. So they tend to go far more for, you know, slow, gradual, menacing build-ups rather than, you know, throwing everything at you or, you know, doing a jump every couple of minutes. And some of the best things that they've done, I mean, not actually, and this is a controversial one, I know, because it divides people very considerably, and it's not supernatural either. But one of the films I saw on Shudder, Jenny and I both, frankly, were just shaken by the end. That's a movie called Speak No Evil.
Right.
Now, if you don't know it, I would recommend you maybe if you could get Shudder on your television. I mean, it starts out as a almost a sort of Scandinavian equivalent of a Mike Lee, you know, comedy of discomfort.
Yeah.
But by God, and apparently that's what they started making. But then they sort of followed where they were where it was leading them, and by heavens, you know, it actually darkens to a nightmare extent, and I'll say no more than that. But that impressed me greatly. But just more generally, you know, as I say, Shudder, they really do seem to be going for, you know, the more gradual narrative. And so if anybody's out there listening, guys, here I am. Contact my agent now.
Yeah, so I think I'm right in saying there has been a couple of adaptations of your work. I think they were both Spanish, weren't they? I think
Yes.
Nameless and was the
Yes. Well, there are actually three. There was, as you say, the name is Llamo Galaguero, Los Sin Nombre, which you can now, I believe, you can get it on a very good Spanish Blu-ray with English subtitles.
Oh, no.
There was Second Name, which sounds like a sequel, but it's not. It's just a coincidental title. It's actually based on a novel of mine called Pact of the Fathers. It has very little to do with the novel, but that's really partly because they brought the first draft, or not first draft, I beg your pardon, the first version I submitted to the publishers, which was disastrously bad. And by the time I'd done the rewrites that my editor quite rightly suggested, they were already in production. So, you know, understandably, they deviated from what I'd written just as I did in the rewrite, but we deviated in different ways. More recently, though, we've had The Influence, which is, I think, probably still on Netflix, actually, La Influencia. But don't confuse that with another movie with the same title, which is not a horror movie. You'll know mine when you see it, and it's pretty good, I'll tell you.
So just before we throw over to the audience for questions, my last question is, obviously, we're looking at a 100th anniversary of Weird Tales.
Yeah,
I think
this
year. So your three top Weird Tales, they don't have to be from Weird Tales as such. But if someone said, what are the three Weird Tales that really epitomise the genre? Which ones would you pick?
Well, yes, I mean, you warned me about that question, so I have been pondering it. And three is hard, 10 not so hard, but I'll do three, okay. So I would say Well, I keep naming it. I know, so obviously, it means a great deal to me. And The Colour Out of Space, for me, is still Lovecraft's greatest story. Partly because it's entirely done by suggestion and allusion, and we never shown anything that directly. And I think it's his most perfect metaphor, if you like, for a sense of cosmic awe and terror. The sense of something completely wrong from somewhere else. I mean, the Call of Cthulhu, or however you pronounce it, is great. Rats of the Walls, I think, is a tremendous piece. But okay, I'll settle on the Colour Out of Space. The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, I think, again, is one of the great evocations of something utterly alien, and again, made up wholly of kind of indirect references. I think both of those stories actually sort of work in terms of sort of suggesting something larger than the narrative can show directly. So if you like, the story becomes a kind of metaphor for what it's about. And I think possibly my all-time favourite is The White People by Arthur Machen, which I just find extraordinarily disturbing in a way almost impossible to pin down. But it is possibly the great example of not so much the unreliable narrator as the unaware narrator, who is telling us far more than she knows she's telling us. And that makes it, extraordinarily disturbing to me. I mean, a recent instance of this, well, just what I'm thinking aloud, is Never Let Me Go, the Ishiguro novel, which again, is a case where the narrator thinks there's nothing wrong with what she's telling us, which makes it all the more horrific because he doesn't realise how dreadful, the situation in which she and her friends find themselves is. But again, just for the three: Colour Out of Space, The Willows, and The White People.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I think to finish off, we'll go to the audience. If anyone has any questions, Tim's going to sprint down. That's a sight to see.
It is a sight. Yeah. It's my exercise for the month, mate. Yeah.
So, any questions?
Anybody raise your hand? I have a question for Ramsey Campbell. Raise your hands.
Oh. There we go. Don't fall down the steps.
If the asteroid or meteorite that landed at May Gardener's farm in the Colour Out of Space were to land in your garden, well or no, when would you leave? If you would leave.
Oh, did you hear that, Ramsey? Or shall I?
No, I didn't. No, so do tell me again.
So when the meteorite from the Colour Out of Space lands at the farm,
yes,
if it landed in your garden, when would you leave, or would you leave?
Immediately.
That sounds like a sensible decision. So yeah, I think that's
Yeah, so the loud bang in the night. Yeah, I think I'll be on my bike going down that dirt track before light.
Yeah, especially if Nicolas Cage was going to turn up as well.
Absolutely. But I have to say, of course, not without grabbing all the work in progress first.
Oh, the notebooks. Got to take the notebooks.
Yeah, oh yes, you bet. My God, yes. I mean, many of those. I mean, here are just two.
Look at that.
Oh, nice. Guys, I saw recently that apparently they've stopped making your preferred type of notebook.
Yes, bastard. Yes.
It's a conspiracy. A conspiracy.
I think it was trying to shut me down, but there you go. Yes.
Is there one more?
Yeah, we've got one more over here. I saw.
It has to be right at the back of the room.
Oh, don't worry.
If you had to meet any character, protagonist or antagonist, from your own fiction, who would be your best and worst to interact with?
Oh, if you had to meet any character, antagonist or protagonist from your own fiction,
yes,
who would it be? Best and worst?
Oh Lord,
that's an interesting question.
Well, worst. It depends. I mean, in terms of kind of evil power, I suppose old Christian Noble out of the trilogy, who seems never. Well, he ages all right, but he seems to never to lose his vigor. And of course, there is a sense. I'm not ruining this. There is a sense in which he and his family may, in some way, be one entity. which is a kind of you think you're original, I do. And I sort of think, well, that's the thing on the doorstep, then, isn't it? So you failed again, haven't you? There you go. One of these days, I'll have an original idea. I can be held in my coffin saying, "Hang on, no, don't put me in the crematorium just yet. I want to write this down." But so I think the Nobles. If I could do a threesome, it will be the Nobles. Those three guys. Although possibly in some ways the most loathsome is Cameron Thaddeus Nash, Lovecraft's correspondent. If you haven't read about him, well, I've edited his correspondence, so you ought to amuse yourselves with that.
Hilarious.
In terms of who would I like to meet? Lordy, what a question! I mean, see, I like quite a number of my characters, but you know what? Maybe the mysterious Adele from Fellstones. I mean, there's something about her that's not quite what it appears to be. I think she's quite an attractive character, but I think or possibly, who knows? Maybe the wise friend. I might learn something then. I need a bit of wisdom at my age, so maybe them. I say them carefully, and if you read the novel, you'll know why.
Excellent. Well, I think that about wraps it up.
Yeah.
We'd like to say a big thank you for joining us today, Ramsey, and a big thank you for providing all of us with so much fantastic work over the years. Thank you for your patience when we were setting up there.
No. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you very much, and great to do it. I mean, so I'm not there in person, but if you could see me from the neck down, you'd know why I never leave the house these days.
Well, on that note, I think, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ramsey Campbell.